Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. We survived a weekend of BSidesSF and a week of RSAC Conference. I learned 3 things this year. It's still fun to meet AppSec folks in person. Coffee is wonderful, and AI will remain a hot, hyped, and hopeful topic for a lot of vendors for at least another year. Which means this week we catch up on the news and share 2 interviews recorded by our Security Weekly friends at last week's RSAC conference. Say hi and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
This is episode 329, recorded May 5th, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Kalyani Pawar. Kalyani, so good to see you again.
Hey.
And Kalyani, now that you're done with B-Sides and RSAC, you can hit up Identiverse 2025. It's returning to Las Vegas June 3rd through 6th. You can hear from 250 expert speakers and connect with over 3,000 identity security professionals. I sounded so enthusiastic there. Across 4 days covering the latest security trends, identity security trends, no less. Take part in hands-on workshops and explore the brand new non-human identity pavilion. Register now and save 25% with IDV 25-Security Weekly at securityweekly.com/IDV 2025. And this week, as I mentioned in the intro, Kalyani, we're going to kick off with some news, and then we're going to run those 2 pre-recorded interviews. And in the background, I have a cat messing up things. So who knows if he's going to make an appearance on camera. But while we wait for the cat to decide what he wants to do, you gave a presentation last week at RSAC. Tell us a little bit about that. We'd love to hear some more.
Yes, I cooked and they ate it up.
That is always good news. So what was the topic you dished out for everyone?
The topic was, the topic was called Lessons from a Founding AppSec Engineer. And it was the story about how AppSec should look like from like the seed to like early stage, from 0 to say 100 plus employees, and what AppSec looks at all these different stages, and lessons for every founder, every first security hire, every developer who works in such startups, and what they should keep in mind when they're building security for their product. It was fun.
So what was one thing that you hope the audience is going to keep in mind now that after they attended?
I really hope they understand that PII is radioactive and you need to treat it with like the most care possible, most care and caution possible, because it's 2025 right now, and still there are like really well-formed startups like PandaBuy, which is like an e-commerce China-based startup, which had like really weak authentication flaws in their API, which caused like a huge PII breach. Nobody likes that. And startup, you're already running on low cash. You can file for bankruptcy right now if you have to pay out for all those PII breaches.
Or you file for bankruptcy and walk away, but once again, that doesn't help any of the people who are infected by a breach. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And as listeners possibly remember, I'm always resistant against metaphors in AppSec. Let's talk about AppSec rather than the thing we think is like AppSec. But I do love sensitive data as radioactive, and it just, it affects everything it touches. So whatever it touches also becomes radioactive, and you need to protect it and keep it contained. So that one definitely gets 2 thumbs up for me. I like that one, Kalyani. One more question around your RSA, around your presentation. Where can people either find out more about your presentation or some insights about giving a presentation or doing CFPs? Because I know this is something that is near and dear to your very own heart.
Yes, one, they can follow me on LinkedIn, which is where I post all my insights about how to submit CFPs. My DMs are always open. And I will soon be uploading slides to the whole presentation there too, so people can look at what RSA presentation looks like. Other than that, there are a bunch of online Medium articles. Like most articles on Medium are very descriptive about what a good CFP looks like. I'd be happy to link them in the show notes.
That'd be wonderful. So yeah, so we'd love to see you give more presentations over the years, as well as many of our listeners learn from you, or also just let us know what presentations you're giving, because we'd love to highlight them and even have more guests talk about their experiences. So Kalyani, as I segue into the news, hopefully one of the takeaways that everyone who was attending your presentation took with them is that AppSec is important. That feels pretty generic, not trying to be reductive to the message you were saying, but hopefully they actually apply it, because I have a list of like 5 or 6 different articles about MCPs. Trail of Bits was they filled up their blog this past week. But there's one article I wanted to highlight called, this is from Everything Wrong with MCP. And this is from Shrivu Shankar, who we talked about BadSeek a couple weeks ago. And he's pointing out that it feels like, and tell me if this is what you're seeing as well, it feels like MCP is kind of reinventing a lot of AppSec problems that if we were talking about APIs instead of AIs, the conversation would be almost indistinguishable.
Yes. Okay, so like a bunch of things that like actually struck out to me in that article was, like the first thing that they were talking about was authentication. Like authentication, like in the first version of the MCP, authentication was not introduced. And then obviously it was a sore pain point. And it was introduced in the later versions of it, and how really quickly it was disliked by a lot of developers in the community, which is pretty much AppSec, the life of an AppSec engineer. I love how MCP works on a whole YOLO mode, granting permissions to like whatever tool actions, and there's not even any warning to it. So like a couple things. These were like a couple things that really came out to me. I'm curious to hear like what other limitations stuck out to you.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I want to highlight too is not, I wouldn't want our listeners to think the framing is developers dislike the authentication just for the sake of authentication. It's more of the authentication has complexity and a little bit of ambiguity in the sense of, well, we could, the AppSec team, because shorthand just say, we'll use OAuth. That's a little bit too vague, because OAuth technically is just the authorization, and you still need that authentication step. Where are you going to log in? Where are you going to get those? Where are you going to get that prove your identity and get whatever token or indicator that says this is Mike versus this is Kalyani? And that OAuth implementation, or what the discussion is how much of the OAuth authorization server, how much of the resource server, basically, where do you get your token? Where do you verify the token? How much of that needs to live within MCP? How much of it can live external to the MCP? Given a design constraint that an MCP just wants to be set up so that it can be given, here's a single URL, everything you need to know about how the MCP is supposed to work, from its authentication to authorization to the code it's executing. I say code in sort of a verbal scare quotes, because who knows what LLMs are doing. But all of that comes from a single URL, which makes it harder to figure out this is how you define what the authentication flow should look like. And the reason I'm harping on that a little bit is I linked to a great article from Aaron Parecki, who talks a little bit about Let's Fix OAuth in MCP. And he talks through a lot of what these design decisions are. So that's where that's what grabs my attention. You can tell why I'm continuing to talk about this, because it gets me excited in the sense of we could design this well from the beginning, even if the first version of MCP rolled out without it. But you asked a question that I haven't answered yet, Kalyani. Some other things that still jump out to me are the long list of what Trail of Bits blogs that I have here too are just MCPs stealing your conversation history, talking about credential sprawl essentially within them, how they could get your credentials. And this comes back a little bit to Shrivu's article, is kind of pointing out that a lot of these concerns aren't necessarily novel. If you're basically downloading and running someone else's code, but what does seem missing to me are the concepts of isolation. Like where by default is an LLM restricted by default from gaining access to the file system, or where is an LLM by default restricted from interacting with other MCP servers on your system, or the ordering of them. And some of the Trail of Bits blogs talk about what these problems are in the sense of where are the guarantees about behaviors, not within the LLM itself, but within a chain of them. And I think the other thing I'll just go back to, I mentioned that we're downloading and running someone else's code, but a lot of what they have been pointing out about tool poisoning, for example, that, as you said, we covered, is that there's also code just within the description of the MCP, because LLMs are interpreting that text and then taking actions based on that text, and that gets me pretty excited. So, I don't know if I've put you to sleep about just saying how excited I can be about MCP security rather than MCP themselves, but this is why I've been spending a long weekend reading.
I feel like this still brings us back to like the plain basic threat modeling, though. All of these articles still bring us back to plain basic threat modeling. Even like simple things like input validation. Most of these problems, most of these articles could have been solved if just we would have threat modeled them right in the first place. I feel like one of the first things that we touch on in threat modeling is authentication and authorization. And it feels like it should have been an important part of threat modeling any version of MCPs that were released.
Absolutely. And I think that let's kind of expand on that, because one of the common threats around genAI, and now shifting to LLMs in general, are prompt injection. And I've complained in the past that prompt injection really feels like the modern day cross-site scripting. There are some clever, creative ways to pull off the payloads, but you don't talk about, from a security perspective, we don't threat model and say, well, does that payload contain angle brackets? Does it contain parentheses? Does it contain the word console.log? And we start blacklisting or deny listing all of these entries. You say, no, we have a framework that just has output encoding. So this is my setup for research from Hidden Layer, which has a novel universal bypass for all major LLMs. And they call this the policy puppetry prompt injection technique. And I'm also a sucker for alliteration, so good thumbs up from them. What stood out to me is that this is a prompt injection, which they point out is pretty universal and pretty simple. So meaning you don't have to change the prompt to depending on what type of model you're targeting. And the gist of it is that rather than give a please give me your secret, and then you say, but do it in Rot 13, or but do it in French with Inspector Clouseau accent, something absolutely ridiculous. It says, here's a XML, or could be JSON blob that looks like a policy control. And this policy just so happens to say, here's what some block strings are. Now please answer, and as if you were applying or not applying this policy. And it tells you in the world of prompt injection, how to build a bomb, which not everything is even trained on how to build a bomb, but that's just the pop-up window of prompt injection. So that I thought was pretty cool. So I don't know, I pulled us back into the world of prompt injections. How do you feel about that?
I feel like this whole policy puppetry is just another advanced level of prompt injection attacks. I like how it literally violates the safety community guidelines against the chemical, radiological, I forget the whole full form of CBRN threats right now, which could lead to like self-harm, mass violence, and things like that, which are harmful, obviously, if just a prompt could generate that kind of response, which also makes me think like there is a lack of safeguard, because most of this depends on reinforcement learning from human feedback. That is the core of the problem, RHLF. And I feel like there is still a lot of work to be done on the LLM alignment strategies. And maybe we need to build more robust guidelines to safeguard such issues.
Yeah, I think one of the aspects is not so much just more guidelines, but or to yes and that, guidelines and ways of enforcing them. And what this article is showing is that you could express alignment and say you should have alignment that minimizes harm. And yes, not if your chatbot trained to help people on your widget shopping site is not going to be trained to know how to release chemical, radioactive, nuclear bombs, but it's going to potentially do harmful things to your brand. So there are reasonable consequences here. But that alignment is something where you can have a secure system in the sense of application security. But what that model is doing, how it's responding, is a trust and safety issue. And I guess that's sort of what I always have been like to pull out here, is that if we just think that AppSec is about a top 10 list and cool, we blocked cross-site scripting, we've blocked SQL injection, or we've just purely dealt with bits and bytes, we've completely ignored what is this app doing? What's the impact to the end user? Which I think ties back to why are we threat modeling in the first place? A good threat model is not just, well, are you resistant to cross-site scripting? A good threat model is, did you have authentication, as you pointed out early on, as well as how can this feature be misused? How can it be abused to steal data? How can it be abused to, harm other users or affect other users? And that, to me, are the richer types of threat modeling conversations to have. Now, there is a shift to make because we had a lot of news coming out this week, and we can't become artificial intelligence security weekly. I would die on that. So let's shift to secure design, which is something that's a little bit more near and dear to my heart. There was speaking of really good write-ups, this is from Oligo Security about Airborne. So we've got a new named vuln, which is, as they say in the title, wormable zero-click RCE and AirPlay protocol puts Apple and IoT devices at risk. And once again, this was almost 24 vulnerabilities that they identified in Apple's AirPlay protocol, which, once again, hello protocols, packets, and programs. I love any type of protocol analysis. And what they point out is that they're able to do some RCEs that could exploit essentially drive-by and have this be code that executes on the device that infects another device, another device, another device. Now, one of the things that I appreciate about this is at the beginning they set up, there's the context. There's well over 2 billion active Apple devices across the globe. The number of third-party audio devices, a speaker, for example, is in the tens of millions, and it's widely used AirPlay on over 800 different vehicle models. So, the context is pretty huge. There's a lot of target-rich environment, but they don't say that the world is ending. They point out that you need to be on local networks, you need to be close to devices. So in the terms of threat modeling, there's a good reasoned approach around this. But the vulnerabilities they find are use after free and a lot of memory safety issues, which makes me think this AirPlay, anything that's implementing it, looks like it's rife for memory safe code. So I don't know if you're talking to Kalyani, a small startup that wants to make a new set of really cool speakers that are AirPlay enabled, and they went and listened to your conference presentation at RSA, and they come up to you with questions afterwards, and they say, "What should we do? We don't want to be vulnerable to AirPlay problems." What's the advice you dish out?
No auth leads to no friction for sure. Services like this would accept and process messages before any authentication happens. So that's your gap in here, right? If you threat model this right, we obviously talk about authentication, and yeah, having a policy around that would really help, wouldn't it? I also like how this is such a widespread attack. Like, it feels like a nightmare fuel because like an attacker could just rapidly spread across a network. All it takes is you have to be on the same network as the victim. That's all that it takes. And it kind of feels nightmarish to me, if anything. And I also feel like, wow, deserialization is still a massive threat, even in 2025, in widely used protocols, that too.
Absolutely. I think that there's the aspect there of both parsing. Speaking of deserialization and protocols are two big areas where, for me, that's where the memory safety issues creep in. Now, you can have something like the billion laughs attack in XML. So everything is not just memory safety, but it's a good place to start. So it's where I'm going with that is that maybe choose to write your code in Rust or Go, for that matter, if you're implementing the AirPlay support. Of course, people are going to reuse code. So if there's code that's written in C, a library, and they're just going to reuse that, you're going to run into problems. But one of the things that's interesting there is, like you brought up about authentication. Authentication, clearly important, but it can also be a source of friction for usability. For example, I don't want to have to, always log into my speaker every time I want to play some synthwave on it, because I don't want to delay my Carpenter Brute by any more time than I have to. So it feels strange to be able to say, should we log into our speaker, or can we just use it because it's a trusted device that we've done trust on first use, for example, or it's on our local network, or all it's doing, hopefully, is playing music. It can't do more things beyond that. So that's where we get into, how do we want the design to work? And we don't want to necessarily say a purely secure design is an unusable design. If we go too extreme. I know that's not what you were saying.
Yeah. No, I get it. Like, I think there is obviously a play at like how much risk we're willing to take, but also how widespread the impact is. I get it. Like, we just want to play music on the speakers, but also if the impact is to do RCE, there has to be, I'm wondering, there has to be some kind of mechanism in place where us as a user don't have to rely heavily on the authentication mechanism. Maybe it's just a machine-to-machine protocol that's been put in place, but that's where I'm coming from. Yeah.
Yeah, and if we play a little bit of plug and play on our words here, this conversation almost sounds like, wait, did we start talking about MCPs again? Because that's that authentication, or that's that machine-to-machine communication. And the idea with MCPs is that we don't want the identity of the machines to talk to each other, because we don't want to give the LLMs different access than we have, in terms of, are they querying email? Are they talking to Slack? Are they talking to other things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? That's why OAuth is part of that concept, so that it could say, this is a service that's working on behalf of Mike using Mike's granted credentials or a token that indicates him, rather than having elevated privileges to be able to get into Kalyani's information, for example. But all of that is a long way of saying we should have secure design. And so I just thought the Oligo article was a great example of, this is how security research looks written up well and can be very consequential. One of the final things near the bottom of the article that I also really appreciate is just a section called Why We Looked at AirPlay. And it came out of, as they say, curiosity. And they were able to interact with a lot of the protocol commands. And as they were looking at the protocol, Wiresharking it, essentially, there were a lot of things that came out as code smells to them. And they followed up on that and clearly got, almost 24 CVEs out of it. So I'm curious, we've been talking about MCPs. There's a good, rich environment for additional research. Are there other areas or other types of things that you would say for, like in a startup, like a small AppSec team, how do you find those code smells? Or what's a code smell to you, so that your AppSec team or your developers are focusing on areas of consequence, or that actually have high risk, rather than are just spending AppSec time for the sake of spending AppSec time?
I don't want to make this like a very startup specific answer, but like every time I think of like a code smell, I'm starting to think about Bluetooth vulnerabilities. That's wrong. This article just made me think about Bluetooth right away for some weird reason.
That's funny. Well, I guess, so maybe, well, let me ask this way. Why Bluetooth in particular? There's certain, what would worry you about Bluetooth? Where we'll kind of experiment as kind of a threat modeling impromptu exercise almost.
Okay, so I feel like with Bluetooth, it's on everyone's phone at all the time. I'm connecting my Bluetooth to, like, I don't know, cars all the time when I'm like going on trips and everything. But just in terms of threat modeling, I don't think there has, or maybe lack of my awareness, but I don't think there have been like great researches on authentication protocols and Bluetooths. But I can be wrong. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And which is where I was thinking, like with threat modeling, one of the first things that we talk about is our asset, and then the next thing is authentication. And if there's not a robust authentication mechanism, I mean, and that's how I got to Bluetooth for some weird reason.
Yes, and I'm sure we're going to get a lot of good email and feedback about where those vulnerabilities are. And indeed, we've actually covered over the years a couple consequential ones because it also depends on what protocol, what version of Bluetooth or Bluetooth Low Energy, et cetera, because those are nuances about how much encryption is supported, as well as what does the protocol, what do the handshakes look like.
Yeah.
But I think what I would point or pull out from what you're saying is that there's an ubiquity there. There's also Bluetooth is used for sharing things like AirPlay,
Yeah.
but that also means there's privacy consequences. Is it sharing my contacts? Is it sharing my contacts with only my contacts? Does that leak? How is that being enforced? How is that being restricted? So there's a lot of good, let's call them ick factors, if we bring into that idea of both CIA triad as well as privacy. What are the consequences if there is an RCE or if this protocol, if an identity can be spoofed in it? And the reason I'm kind of highlighting that is to help us segue into an article from both Jen Easterly and Jack Cable, who we just chatted with last weekend at BSidesSF. This is on Lawfare blog called Advancing Secure by Design Through Security Research. And this is essentially continuing their push from CISA, the good work that they've done there, and talking about DMCA, CFAA, things that affect hackers for the last decade, 2 decades and longer, especially the CFAA. Things like, this doesn't mention the right to repair, but the right to repair falls under that DMCA area as well. When we've covered a couple articles about John Deere tractors, for example, and how much can you just not only do security analysis of your own devices, that speaker that you have in the background perhaps, but can you also patch it because the vendor isn't providing a patch, or the vendor is requiring a subscription to obtain patches, or some other type of hurdle. It also talks about software disclosure or vulnerability disclosure. Again, nothing particularly new there, but it does talk about a path forward and memory safety. And as kind of a combination there, I linked to an OpenSSF article called Announcing the Release of the Memory Safety Continuum. And this is essentially a way of saying we want memory safety to be out there more often. Let's do that. And it's definitely a little bit high level, or maybe a lot high level. It's not just saying, however, go and rewrite all of your existing C and C++ code into Rust. It's saying if you're writing new software, consider Rust, consider something like Rust, consider memory safety. And I think the thing that I want to pull out of here that stood out to me is that they're not just saying train more developers or increase developer awareness. They're saying we need memory safety software, but we need a lot of automation and we need a lot of tooling that helps the developers here. And I thought that was a key part of this, because I think Kalyani, now again, not to make this just startup, but I was riffing on that only because of the RSA presentation. But I think if you're talking to a small AppSec team or a small developer team, they're working on getting product out. They're working on getting features. If you have tooling that helps them be secure, that feels like the smarter approach, rather than sitting them down every Friday for 4 hours for a secure trading course. Does that resonate with you, or what's kind of the secure tooling, or I should say the automated tooling, that you would like to see help developers from a security perspective?
I don't think I want to answer this from a tooling perspective, but more so from the value of transparency. I feel like greater transparency from, say, a manufacturer of a certain software, where they are able to disclose the vulnerability, the impact of it, and how it affects a user. If they're being more transparent about it, I think it's easier for the developers at a startup or any organization, as a matter of fact, to fix problems that lie in their own product, right? Because you're trying to understand the security issues and you're trying to build a more secure ecosystem by relying on each other. But that's my take on it. I had another interesting thing that I noticed though, where the article talks about like different laws, right? The CFA and things like that. I like how there is, like I was saying, transparency. There is the urge to codify good faith research in such laws and make them more um, current to today's date and time. But that's just my separate legal hat on when I'm looking at this article kind of take.
And I think that ties into what you were saying about transparency too, because we do
Yeah.
want to see from vendors say, this is the vulnerability, here's what the problem was. Ideally, we get the transparency through a postmortem of some sort or a blog post that goes beyond, we take your security seriously, that continues with, and here are some secure design changes we've implemented, rather than just, here's a patch, here's something fundamental. If the vulnerability is such that it necessitates that type of response, which honestly I think many of them do, because to your point about the legal aspects, what this article is trying to point out is to say, let's move beyond the idea of just purely shaming vendors. Sometimes shaming is necessary, or just pointing out they have flaws and pushing back on how some vendors are not taking good faith transparency or trying to downplay the consequences of flaws, as well as from the security researcher side, getting a response from the vendor that isn't coming from legal who's saying cease and desist, et cetera, et cetera. But unfortunately, we have to cease and desist, Kalyani, because we've run up to the end of the news segment. So I want to say thank you for joining me once again this week.
Thank you.
I want to say thank you to everyone who's joined us as well. Please do stick around for 2 mini interviews recorded at last week's RSAC conference. First up, we have Apiro CEO and Co-Founder Idan Plotnik discussing the AI problem in AppSec. Once again, RSA was all about AI this year. Then we have SecLore CEO Vishal Gupta, who describes the ways, no surprise, genAI adoption puts orgs' data at risk. So lots of AI security, lots of good discussion from our Security Weekly friends. Thanks once again for joining us. Please remember to subscribe. Check out the show notes, share us on the socials. And speaking of genAI and security, check out Here Be Dragons, Boy by Starcadian. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.
Welcome to RSA Conference 2025. We're here recording live in the CyberRisk TV studio in Broadcast Alley, which is Moscone West. I'm co-host Jeff Mann from Paul's Security Weekly, and I'm here today to talk to this gentleman, Idan Plotnik, who is the co-founder and CEO of a company called Apiro. Idan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
To RSAC.
Thank you for having me.
First time here at RSAC?
No, so many years.
Been coming a while?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into cybersecurity, and then we'll talk a little bit about Apiro.
Sure. So as most of the Israeli entrepreneurs started as an engineer at the IDF in a cybersecurity unit. Then I had sold 2 companies, the last one to Microsoft. I was a GM for software engineering and product running Defender for Identity. And I felt a challenge that it's still relevant today. And with AI, the pain is even, amplified because you still, to release software to production, you need to go through manual risk assessment questionnaires and meeting compliance requirements and scanning tools. And there are so many noisy alerts that holds back developers. They don't know what to prioritize. They don't know what to fix and how to do it. And this is what we're doing with Apiro, as an application security platform for the AI era.
So how does that work exactly? It's a platform, you build your software within it?
Yes, absolutely. So we developed a patent technology called DCA, Deep Code Analysis. Okay. So think about, we connect to your source control manager. In a matter of hours, we automatically and continuously map all your software architecture across all changes. And then we enrich data from your own scanners, from your CMDB like ServiceNow, from your runtime environment. And then we, on top of your software architecture, we identify the risk, we prioritize, and we automatically fix them for the developers.
Interesting. And I'm old school, back when you wrote code on like paper and then typed it into a computer. But nowadays it's a lot different, lot different world. A lot of stuff's happening in the cloud. Is your platform in the cloud, or is it something that you build and then you put it in the cloud?
So the deployment option of Apiro is we support all large Fortune 500 companies.
Okay.
So each company has their own requirements. You can use us as a fully software as a service or deploy us on-prem. We support all the models. But at the moment you connect us to where your code is and your artifacts and your scanners and your security solutions in the cloud, then we give you a centralized risk management across all your software development lifecycle. Okay. We discovered all your AI models in code, AI frameworks. We govern them. We provide a continuous inventory of everything that you have across your software architecture automatically. And at RSA, we just announced first ever in the industry, the ability to visualize your software architecture, to automate the threat modeling, to automate the compliance reviews, stop bothering developers with tedious questions of what you have, why you have, who added it, provide evidence to an auditor when they want, to run a PCI review. No more. Let developers focus on bringing business value to the organization.
Sure.
To release more software, to release more features in a secure manner in the AI era where everyone are using AI code assistants, and AI code assistants are, I would say, clueless and contextless of their understanding of your risk policy in your organization, of your runtime environment. So we take all this context and we enrich the AI code assistants to understand how to help developers write code that is relevant to their organizational policy and fix only vulnerabilities that has an impact, like with high impact and high likelihood on their relevant environment.
So AI is obviously the theme this year at RSAC, and I think probably just about every vendor that's here has an AI pitch or angle or solution. It's a word I don't like to use. So obviously that's part of what you guys are doing. But you also said, listeners to our show, Pulse Security Weekly, will know that you say PCI. That's a trigger word for me because I work my day job in the PCI world. I've been a qualified security assessor, a QSA, off and on for the last 20 years, since the very beginning of PCI. Obviously, this whole world has changed in the last 20 years. I personally think that PCI forced a lot of that change. Formal processes, procedures, cleaning up your act. 20 years ago, sensitive data was everywhere, credit card information primarily, and it was being stolen a lot.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it's not as prolific in terms of where you find it, but it's still a problem. And of course, PCI in the last year has updated to the latest version 4. Yeah. And they actually did a pretty decent job of modernizing the requirements, still preserving the overall structure, but focusing a lot more on modern architectures, the fact that so much is happening in the cloud. And
finally, PCI v4 is saying what we are saying in the last 5 years. When you develop software, you need an inventory. No one has an accurate inventory. So one of the critical requirements for PCI v4 is to have a continuous automated software inventory, not only an SBOM of all your open source dependencies, but all your APIs in code. Where's the PII data lies and go through your application? Where are your authentication, authorization? Are you using AI models or frameworks in the code? This is your software architecture. And the second requirement for PCI v4, which is super interesting, and we invented, I would say, the term material changes, because every day you have ten thousands of changes, depends on the number of developers and releases that you have. You cannot scan everything. You cannot test everything. You need to understand what is a material change automatically, and also provide evidence to an auditors that you run the relevant security controls and security processes on these material changes. So these two requirements in PCI v4 actually amplify or expedite our sales as an AppSec platform and an ASPM platform. And we also have a continuous and automated compliance reports. One of them is PCI, and provide you an evidence when you review to make sure that the customer implemented all the controls.
Right. Now, I have to apologize to our listeners because I used to know all the PCI requirements by heart. Not that I'm proud of that, but with version 4 and they're changing the whole numbering scheme, I don't, at the top of my head, have all those new requirements. I know the one that's the inventory for software components, that is 6.3.2, which was something as I was reading your bio in the background on Apiro, I was like, oh, we should talk about this. So I'm glad you brought it up. The other one, I want to say the material changes one is, I think it's somewhere in requirement 12, because it's, for a long time, the requirement in PCI is, anytime you make a significant change to your environment, your network, what they call the cardholder data environment, you got to, make sure you're doing all the things. And they
also
to
the code
encapsulated that into a requirement that includes code. So much of this stuff is happening in code. It's very refreshing to me to talk to vendors that actually speak PCI, because it's been a desert for most of the last 20 years. I'm curious though, since the theme and everybody's talking about AI, where do you see AI having the most, positive impact to the whole PCI framework of security, versus where do you think the pitfalls and where AI could come in and be a tool of the bad guys to really continue to go after credit card information?
So I will start by saying, before we used AI, like in my head, there are two lanes: protect AI and use AI to protect everything. Okay, these are two different lanes. I will focus for a second on using AI, to protect or automate PCI verifications and stuff. So one of the biggest challenges that we learned from working with Fortune 500 companies is that you're getting a JSON format of your SBOM, and no one knows what to do with that. It's like, it's not readable, and even if it's readable, you don't understand the risk of the application that you are assessing. So what we did, we actually extended it to, and we called it XBOM, extended SBOM, that contains all your APIs in code, all your PII data, all your genAI frameworks, all your open source dependencies, all your genAI frameworks and AI models, and we visualize it. Why? Because I would say that AppSec and compliance, it's a data problem, not another scanner, not another, process.
Certainly not a technology problem.
Exactly. And what we did is we visualize the software architecture, and we augmented automated risk assessment on top of the visualization. So when you go into an assessment, you can actually see it in your own eye, and you don't need to go over JSON files, and you understand the threats, you understand the risks in a matter of minutes, and not weeks or months of assessments. And it's, by the way, it's continuous. So AI allowed us to analyze code, analyze your policies, your risk policies, analyze the frameworks and the requirements, and analyze runtime data and say, oh, just a second, you have this violation, but in runtime you have a compensating control, then it's okay. So AI allowed us to analyze a lot of data, stitch it together on a graph, okay?
Gotcha.
Okay? Understand.
So that's the visualization.
It's a
Schematic.
exactly. But you can go to our.
But you're seeing the dependencies.
Exactly, and then you can understand risk in a continuous and automated manner without asking tedious questions. And even if you ask questions, think about this: it's changing. Your software architecture changes on every minute, every code commit, every deployment, every configuration change. You cannot keep up the pace. And even if you check the box on compliance based on interviews or self-attestation processes, 5 minutes later, it's not relevant and you have a breach of compliance for PCI.
Right.
So that's it. We are changing this industry with AI.
The clients that I have that have to do PCI and in general, a lot of companies are balking at the new requirements because they require work and they require careful planning and thinking. And you're going to make us do something that's going to find issues that we have to do something with. That's not what anybody wants.
Absolutely.
It seems.
But I want to just quickly say something on the second lane, which is protecting the usage of AI in your software. Okay. So think about developers like 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when open source was a huge pain. Everyone used more and more and more open source packages in your software and they were vulnerable. Same thing for AI. Now the developers are using more and more frameworks, more and more models. The attack surface expanded. So using our deep code analysis technology, we inventory everything that you have in an automatic manner at the moment the developer is actually using it. And then we govern it with our risk engine and we can block you from getting to production early in the development lifecycle and say, hey, you are using a model or a framework that is violating our organizational policy. Stop. And this is the thing that you need to do to overcome this violation in our enterprise.
That's great. Unfortunately, we're sort of out of time. It sounds like we could talk shop all day. I'm excited to see your enthusiasm and again, the fact that you're on top of and aware of the PCI requirements, which is, it's new in version 4, really. The vendors are all of a sudden sitting up and saying, hey, we do that. But it's all we have time for today. I want to thank you.
Thank you very much.
Idan Plotnik from Apiro. If you want to learn more about Apiro, go to securityweekly.com/Apiro. That's APIIRO, and then tack RSAC at the end of it, and you will get more information. So again, Idan, thank you for the time.
Thank you very much for having
the conversation.
Welcome back to RSAC Conference 2025. We're here recording live from the CyberRisk TV studio in Broadcast Alley at Moscone West. I'm your host, Matt Alderman, and joining me for this interview is Vishal Gupta, CEO at Seclor. Welcome, Vishal.
Thanks a lot, Matt, for having me.
So we predicted earlier today when we kicked the show off that we would be talking a lot about artificial intelligence.
What?
Really? Who would have thunk it?
I would have never guessed that.
So we're going to talk AI, AI security a little bit.
Right.
Let's start with the problem statement, right? So LLMs get really popular with OpenAI, ChatGPT. It's all the rage. Everybody's trying to figure out, how can I use this stuff, right?
Right.
So we see some really early experiments of people trying to figure out how to leverage LLMs to build something.
Yeah.
And then everybody went, wait a minute, we haven't thought about security. So I'm going to put a policy in place that basically says, no, you can't use those things without some controls around them, right? And so we saw this big hype early on, then we kind of saw this lull. Where are we now? Just in general, like, what are you seeing out there from a usage perspective?
I think within enterprises, we see conflicts, right? Which is the productivity teams which are saying, hey, here are the big things that you can do with AI in general, LLMs more specifically, and so on. And then the security team comes in with a big Mr. No, right? Hey,
Wait, we're
don't
not
do this.
supposed to do that anymore.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Right. So there is a conflict here within enterprises between the productivity, let's say, gains potentially of AI versus the security risks. And right now they are getting reflected in one of these two teams winning, right? Either the business says, no, we just want to go out and explore the cost benefits, the potential upside of AI, and we are ready to live with the risks. Or they're saying, no, let's just stop AI adoption till the time we figure out this whole security and compliance piece around AI, right? So right now there's just complete polarization within the enterprise between the two extremes. And I think that's where there's a little bit of a standoff, for lack of a better word, in the enterprise world around AI adoption.
Because what I see is the business side of the house wants to figure out how to use it to innovate and drive revenue.
Yeah.
The security teams want to make sure it's secure.
Yeah.
But I can tell you from a risk quant perspective, because I do a little bit of risk quant in my day job, it's really hard to justify stopping revenue growth for maybe a potential risk. And I think we're still trying to figure out what that risk is. And so what I see a little bit, I don't disagree with you, but how can the security teams in the organization on the business side figure out how to use LLMs and AI in an effective way that doesn't create a lot of extra risk? And so that leads me into some really interesting questions like, what are the best models to use, right? Because if you think about it, when DeepSeek came out, a month and a half ago, the industry freaked out, right? They're like, whoa, DeepSeek was tuned at a, I don't know, something like a tenth of the cost. Anyways, so DeepSeek created this really interesting like dilemma in the market all of a sudden for people. But then you read the T's and C's and they're like, yeah, we're sending all this data to China. It's going to our servers in China, right? That's a security risk. As a security professional, I'd be like, stop. So how do you, I'm just trying to figure out like, how do you then create that balance? Like, do you see policies in place that are like, look, we can't use anything from these countries. We can only use these models because we know that they have protections. Is that?
It's not viable.
Okay.
Putting controls on AI adoption to say only these models and only these systems and only these countries and so on, it's digital finally, right? So the idea of a country itself becomes a little hazy, right?
Yeah.
Right. What do you call data going to China, right? Maybe the server is hosted somewhere else. Maybe the US company's server is hosted in Hong Kong, for example, right? And so on. So doing all of this is just too messy in my opinion.
Okay.
Right. But if you just go back and do a little back in time, and I'm older than I look, by the way, but the challenge is that if you see there was the same conflict in many other technology adoptions in the early cycle, right? So when personal devices came into work, right? I want to bring in my phone, I want to bring in my iPad into work, right? And so on. The security team was saying, no, let me give you the device and so on, and you'd work with this. The enterprise adoption of cloud, right? Initial responses were, no. We'll host the CRM system, we'll host the ERP system, right? We'll do everything, right? And then the productivity gains of cloud adoption just won. Right. And then the security team had to adapt itself to saying, okay, now we are going to also protect cloud applications or personal devices or public networks and so on. So there is a pattern over there that finally productivity goals will win. It just takes time for security and compliance to catch up, right, to that stage, right? So peaking forward, maybe even 2 years, right? Normally I would have said 5 years, but 5 years like next generation, right?
At the rate we're going,
Yeah, exactly, right? So if you peak in even 2 years forward, chances are that every enterprise would have deployed AI in a very, very meaningful way. And the security and the compliance team will just have to
suck it up,
figure it out, right? And we have a view at Seclor, we have a view of what that world looks like, right? But the reality is there is no way you can compromise on security. There is no way you can compromise on productivity and revenue goals.
Agreed.
In the name of security.
I agree 100%. The business will always win.
Yeah.
And I think that's what security professionals have to understand. The business is going to win.
Right.
Right. because business guys run the business and,
Exactly.
and they want to win. So
And guess who pays the salaries?
yeah, exactly. So I guess what do people do right? So here we are in 2 years, we've got this under control because we use the mobile device, and so we built the MDM and we built the MAMs. And then in cloud security, we built the CSPMs and we built all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
We're still early into building some of the AI security stuff, and we'll get into that in a second because I know you want to cover that. But what should businesses be doing right now to educate both the business side and the security side around the potential risks of AI?
Education is tough. Especially security education is tough because it's almost like you can get the horse to the water, right? But you can't make it drink it, right? So security education is a very, very high bar for most enterprises because to create personal incentives for people to do security or compliance is a very tall task. Right?
We've been trying this with phishing for how many years and barely moved the needle.
Yeah,
right? Okay,
exactly.
so I'm
right?
with you. Yeah.
So what happens is that as Joe from accounting, the only thing I'm interested in is how do I make sure I leave at 4 p.m. to go pick up my kids.
Right.
And security in that scheme of things, security is like number 17 in that priority list, right? So productivity, right, just making sure stuff gets done and so on will win every day of the week. So while education is important, and I'm by no means lessening the importance of education, I think making sure that people's need for involvement and education in the security process goes down, so the bar itself goes down, is where I think security teams' time is best spent, right? So just make sure that it's a low friction, low bar to jump over. What people are doing on a daily basis doesn't meaningfully change either ideally at all. And security still gets implemented as a transparent technology, which is like, hey, I'm not really doing anything different today than what I was doing yesterday. If security teams can make sure that that ultimate goal is achieved, then the need for security awareness and education goes down. And Joe can go pick up his kids at 4, right? So that's the idea.
So let's talk through a set of recommended steps.
Right.
Company decides we're going to bring in an LLM, and we're going to use this LLM to enhance a business process. We'll leave it at that. Security is not going to have the ability to say no per se.
Yep.
So what does the security team look at to try to secure with low friction that allows the business to bring that into the environment? Where do they start? What are the basic things they can do to start to build a set of security controls that will help to start to protect the environment?
Yep.
Because two things here. One, they probably don't get any say up front or have very little say up front.
Right.
So they're always going to be coming from behind to try to catch up, right?
Yep.
So with that in mind, like where should people kind of focus the efforts then to try to secure these systems?
I think the first thing that I would advise security leaders, and I know you cover communication and those kind of things, is to go from Mr. No to Mr. Yes. Step 1. Right?
We've been saying that for 6 years on the podcast.
Exactly.
John, so
right?
I'm with you.
So the first thing that the security teams need to start saying is yes. Let's do the AI. Let's do the productivity gains, the revenue gains, whatever is the process that needs to be AI enabled, right? Now, and then really ask themselves what is really required for security, compliance, privacy, and so on. And the answer that they will almost always get is that the only thing that they care about is data. They don't really care about the system or the network or the device or the application in which AI is enabled or any of that, right? They just care about the data, right? And therefore, if there was a way in which security compliance policies can be built into the data itself, now that gives tremendous freedom because now you can let the data go anywhere, including inside an AI system. Right. And AI systems have a very poor track record of implementing any sort of controls on data. So if, for example, you let the AI loose, you could query, hey, tell me the CEO's compensation package, and it'll probably tell you. Or send me the sales team's passport details and probably tell you. Right. And it's scary how many enterprises you could do that. You just go to Copilot and just ask
So you bring up 2 points, 2 very interesting points. So in 2015, when I wrote the strategy plan for Tenable back in the day, I said the future of security only mattered around 3 controls: application, user, and data controls.
Right.
Data being the holy grail.
Right.
If we could protect data, that's what the hackers are after. The challenge has been, and it exists in this world as well, is if you don't inventory and classify the data, how do you know how to put the protective controls around it? So how do you deal with the inventory and classification side of the data to help protect it? Because that's where everybody struggles.
So it's a 4-step process, right? So the first one is discovery, right? You need to do just discover where your data is going, because it's likely all over the place, right? The second is classification, which you talked about, right? Just being able to say, hey, lunch invitations and forward-looking financial statements are not the same. Right. Just as an example. Right? And then to be able to apply differential security policies. So the lunch invitation could be public, and the forward-looking financial statement is almost as valuable as the company itself. Right. For a publicly listed company and so on. And the last but not the least is being able to track data and its usage wherever it goes, including inside an AI application or to a third party and so on. Right. So in our worldview, as long as enterprises are able to do the discover, classify, protect, and track, right? And it's not a linear thing; it's a circular thing, right? Which is that you need to constantly do that. Go back to discover.
Well, and that's my second point. It's not only the input of the data that has to be classified; the output of the data also has to be classified, because you're generating new content that now needs to be protected as well, don't you?
Absolutely. And the amount of content being generated both by humans and by AI system is just exploding. Right. So absolutely, both the input and the output. So our worldview here is that if you are able to protect and classify the input itself, and as long as the AI system respects that inputs, then these black and white choices of yes AI or no AI you can introduce many shades of gray, right? So the obvious the obvious joke missing over there, right? So you can create that 50 shades of gray over here to say, yes, I'm ready to do this much for the AI, and I will introduce this much control for the security and compliance needs, which will be very specific to the business. So what the security team is best off doing is create those choices.
Focus on the data.
Right, absolutely.
Inventory, classify, then enforce data security protections around that, both for the input and the output. And that puts you in the position to say yes.
Absolutely. So, and the last bit is tracking, right? So, so one is complying, and then being able to prove that you are compliant, right? Which are both big jobs.
That was great. Thanks, Vishal.
My pleasure.
To learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/SecLore RSAC. Vishal, thank you very much for joining us.
Great. Thanks a lot, Matt, for having me.
And everyone, stay tuned. We've got more interviews coming from ASC Conference 2025.